Demoralization, like the Black Plague of the Middle Ages, spread in every direction, immediately following the first overt acts of war. Men who were millionaires at nightfall awoke the next morning to find themselves bankrupt through depreciation of their stock holdings. Prosperous firms of importers were put out of business. International commerce was dislocated to an extent unprecedented in history. The greatest of hardships immediately following the war, however, were visited upon those who unhappily were caught on their vacations or on their business trips within the area affected by the war. Not only men, but women and children were subjected to privations of the severest character. Notes which had been negotiable, paper money of every description, and even silver currency suddenly became of little value. Americans living in hotels and pensions, facing this sudden shrinkage in their money, were compelled to leave the roofs that had sheltered them. That which was true of Americans was true of all other nationalities, so that every embassy and the office of every consul became a miniature Babel of excited, distressed humanity. The sudden seizure of railroads for war purposes in Germany, France, Austria, and Russia cut off thousands of travelers in villages that were almost inaccessible. Europeans, being comparatively close to their homes, were not in straits as severe as the Americans, whose only hope for aid lay in the speedy arrival of American gold. Prices of food soared beyond all precedent, and many of these hapless strangers went under. Paris, the brightest and gayest city in Europe, suddenly became the most somber of dwelling places. No traffic was permitted on the highways at night, no lights were permitted, and all the cafes were closed at 8 o'clock. The gay capital was placed under iron military rule. Seaports, and especially the pleasure resorts in France, Belgium, and England, were placed under a military supervision. Visitors were ordered to return to their homes, and every resort was shrouded with darkness at night. The records of those early days are filled with stories of dramatic happenings. On the night of July 31st, Jean-Léon Jaurès, the famous leader of French socialists, was assassinated while dining in a small restaurant near the Paris Bourse. His assassin was Raoul Villain. Jaurès had been endeavoring to accomplish a union of French and German socialists with the aim of preventing the war. The object of the assassination appeared to have been wholly political. On the same day, stock exchanges throughout the United States were closed, following the example of European stock exchanges. Ship insurance soared to prohibitive figures. Reservists of the French and German armies living outside of their native land were called to the colors, and their homeward rush still further complicated transportation for civilians. All the countries of Europe clamored for gold. North and South America complied with the demand by sending cargoes of the precious metal overseas. The German ship Kronprinzessin, with a cargo of gold, attempted to make the voyage to Hamburg, but a wireless warning that Allied cruisers were waiting for it off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland compelled the big ship to turn back to safety in America. Channel boats bearing American refugees from the continent to London were described as floating hells. London was excited over the war and holiday spirit, and overrun with 5,000 citizens of the United States tearfully pleading with the American ambassador for money for transportation home or assurances of personal safety. The condition of the terror-stricken tourists fleeing to the friendly shores of England from continental countries, crowded with soldiers dragging in their wake heavy guns, resulted in an extraordinary gathering of 2,000 Americans at a hotel one afternoon, and the formation of a preliminary organization to afford relief. Some people who attended the meeting were already beginning to feel the pinch of want, with little prospects of immediate succor. One man and wife with 4 children had 6 cents when he appealed to Ambassador Page after an exciting escape from German territory. Oscar Strauss, worth 10 millions, struck London with $9. Although he had letters of credit for 5,000, he was unable to cash them in Vienna. Women hugging newspaper bundles containing expensive Paris frocks and millinery were herded in third-class carriages and compelled to stand many hours. They reached London utterly fatigued and unkempt, but mainly cheerful, only to find the hotels choked with fellow countrymen fortunate to reach there sooner. The ambassador was harassed by anxious women and children who asked many absurd questions which he could not answer. He said, "The appeals of these people are most distressing. They are very much excited, and no small wonder. I regret I have no definite news of the prospects or plans of the government for relief. I have communicated their condition to the Department of State and expect a response and assurances of coming aid as soon as possible. That the government will act, I have not the slightest doubt. I am confident that Washington will do everything in her power for relief. How soon? I cannot tell. I have heard many distressing tales during the last 48 hours." The crowd filled the ambassador's office on the first floor of the flat building in Victoria Street, which was mainly composed of women, school teachers, art students, and other persons doing Europe on a shoestring. Many were entirely out of money and with limited securities which were not negotiable. The action of the British government extending the bank holiday till Thursday of that week was discouraging news for the new arrivals from the continent, as it was uncertain whether the express and steamship companies would open in the morning for the cashing of checks and the delivery of mail, as was announced the previous Saturday. Doctors J. Riddle Goff of New York, Frank F. Simpson of Pittsburgh, Arthur D. Balloon of Vistaburg, Michigan, and B. F. Martin of Chicago formed themselves into a committee and asked the cooperation of the press in America to bring about adequate assistance for the marooned Americans and to urge the bankers of the United States to insist on their letters of credit and travelers' checks being honored as far as possible by the agents in Europe upon which they were drawn. In the first weeks of the war, the Germans occupied Reims, but were driven out after von Kluck's retreat. On September 20, 1914, they were reported as first shelling the Cathedral of Reims, and the civilized world stood aghast, for the edifice, begun in 1212, is one of the chief glories of Gothic architecture in all Europe. The ex-emperor and his sons leading a procession in Berlin soon after the declaration of war. It was noted that in spite of their martial appearance, the royal family were extremely careful to keep out of range of the Allied guns. From left to right, they are the Kaiser, Crown Prince Wilhelm, Princes Idel Friedrich, Adelgert, August, Oskar, and Joachim. Dr. Martin and Dr. Simpson, who left London on Saturday to fetch back a young American girl, were unable to get beyond Paris, and they returned to London. Everywhere they found trains packed with refugees, whose only object in life, apparently, was to reach the Channel boats, accepting cheerfully the discomforts of those vessels, if only able to get out of the war. Reverend J. P. Garfield of Claremore, New Hampshire, gave the following account of his experiences in Holland. On sailing from the Hook of Holland near midnight, we pulled out just as the boat train from The Hague arrived. The steamer paused, but as she was filled to her capacity, she later continued on her voyage, leaving fully 200 persons marooned on the wharf. Our discomforts while crossing the North Sea were great. Every seat was filled with sleepers. The cabins were given to women and children. The crowd, as a rule, was helpful and kindly, the single men carrying the babies and people lending money to those without funds. Despite the refugee conditions prevailing, it was noticeable that many women on the Hook Wharf clung tenaciously to bandboxes containing Parisian hats and millinery. Travelers from Cologne said that searchlights were operated from the tops of the hotels all night, searching for airplanes, and machine guns were mounted on the famous Cologne Cathedral. They also reported that tourists were refused hotel accommodations at Frankfurt because they were without cash. Men, women, and children sat in the streets all night. The trains were stopped several miles from the German frontier, and the passengers, especially the women and children, suffered great hardship, being forced to continue their journey on foot. Passengers arriving at London from Montreal on the Cunard Line steamer Andania, bound for Southampton, reported the vessel was met at sea by a British torpedo boat and ordered by wireless to stop. The liner then was led into Plymouth as a matter of precaution against mines. Plymouth was filled with soldiers, and searchlights were seen constantly flashing about the harbor. Otis B. Kent, an attorney for the Interstate Commission of Washington, arrived in London after an exciting journey from Petrograd. He was unable to find accommodations at a hotel, so he slept on the railway station floor. He said, "I had been on a trip to Sweden to see the midnight sun.